I'm going to give you 7 reasons that a Christian cannot support nor watch the NFL, especially the Super Bowl. But before I do share that with you, those 7 main reasons, I want to ask the question, is the NFL rigged? Now, I began to have my suspicions of this 22 years ago, roughly, when 9/11 transpired, and all of a sudden, the whole country is unified and coming together, which was stellar. People were actually endorsing God as being in their life and as part of their life, and you could feel a unity in America. But then, ironically, the Patriots stepped forward and began to have a great season, and then the next thing you know, they're in the Super Bowl. Now, being an intuitive man, and I would say a discerner deep in my spirit, it felt like something was off, and I don't have any proof of any of this. But as it went forward, then the Patriots win the Super Bowl, and my spidey senses began to tingle, probably much like yours are today, seeing all these heinous calls on this past weekend's activities. So is it rigged? I would just beg you to begin to look at this objectively instead of getting caught up as if this thing is absolute reality. Maybe just take a gander and a ponder at such. In considering why Christians can't be supporters of the NFL, I want to start with terrible reasons first, or my worst reasons first. And one of the first is the disposability of the players. Now, the average life, from what I understand, of a player is about 2.5 years. That is a terribly short career, especially if we consider that these NFL players, this might be the best thing that they ever do in their entire life. What is it like to only be good at something and fulfilled at it for about 2.5 years before you are cast away or written off as a has-been? Now, these NFL guys, they get lifted up to glorious positions, and then in the blink of an eye are now below common folk and are cast off and are forgotten about. See, it's easy to get caught up in watching the team and actually watching the uniforms and following season after season. But what happens to all these has-beens? And I will tell you that some of this began to really strike at my heart years ago when I was managing a grocery store, and one of these old NFL stars came in and was the cashier for a day at our location. It broke my heart because this man had known the greatest thing in society and now was like garbage. He had been cast off by the same society that had pinned him up so highly. So I think that's really not fair to take away the glory that is given to one, and so obviously we should be very careful about who we lift up to begin with or why we are lifting them up. I think we're supposed to be lifting up God, but that's a different discussion. But also, the disposability as players is based on their performance. Like, instead of running 500 yards, you're now running 400 yards, so we just got to get rid of you. And I wonder if that same concept applies in the church. Like, if people are not giving well, then maybe they should be disposed of. If they're not bringing people to Christ, are they supposed to be gotten rid of? Or if they fail and stumble at reading their Bible and their devotions this week, are we supposed to just cast them off and just get rid of them and throw them away? Jesus, if that was the case, Jesus would have chosen the Pharisees, but we know that he did not. So I think there's this opposition there that's just not really reconcilable to the rational person. Also, what about if you're injured, you're out? Some of these guys get minor injuries and it just hinders the rest of their career almost instantly. And then a lot of them get obviously major injuries and it immediately destroys their career just because they are injured. And that brings me back to the weak people of the church. What if somebody gets a divorce or has depression or they get sick or they're handicapped or they gain a disease? Is the church just kind of supposed to get rid of them? And so we're told to focus on those that are broken But yet we find this focus in the NFL that is exactly opposite of that, and it's just too uncanny for me to personally swallow. And also, what about age? In the NFL, age is nearly glorified. If you're old, if you're old at the age of 30, you're done. It's over with. But in the scriptures, in the Bible, in the Christian context, the older a person gets and the wiser they become, they should be more and more exalted and held up. And that's just quite the contrast. Well, let's move on. What about the commercial monetary enterprise that the NFL has become? You see, it's all about money. That is the bottom line. And it amazes me the incredible expenditure for vanishing moments. These millions upon millions of dollars that are used to corral people and their television sets to certain moments in time to catch a few things on film and to kind of get some emotional moments together. And then it's done. Nothing has been built. Nothing is permanent. Everything is over. Nothing charitable has been accomplished. And no one is really the better for such, except for, for a few people that might wear some rings or whatnot, maybe get some bonuses. But the incredible expenditure of that, it's actually gross how much money is funneled into that event to really build it up. And I wonder if we poured that much money towards other things, what might actually be accomplished or, actually happen in our culture. What about the expense of the poor to participate in such? Now, if you can imagine the average common working man who, we're always saying, doesn't have enough money, he's barely getting by. But then we charge these incredible amounts for game tickets. Or let's put it down lower than that. What about the person that just has to pay for this incredible cable package to be able to watch his television at home because he can't really afford the ticket prices? But to identify out in culture, he's at least got to get the $20 or $25 hat. And so money that he really doesn't have is gathered by the rich. That's just a little troubling to me. And I also don't understand this commercialization of selling beer and sensuality and indulgence grotesquely throughout the entire commercial process of the whole NFL enterprise. It appeals to the base desires of humanity, to the flesh of people. And Christians just wholesale are okay with this. It's okay if this is the main advertising of such. Not to mention the raunchiness of the halftime shows. Now there's so many Christians here that just turn a blind eye to it. They're like, we'll just turn it off during the halftime show. Or I was at the halftime show and, I went and got some cheese and crackers or, whatever, some nacho cheese. But can you imagine if a pastor brought in some strippers and had them dance on some poles in the middle of his sermon? He just stopped and he sat down and we're just going to watch this performance. And then they watched, the strippers engage in some raunchy activity. This sounds like the NFL. And then all of a sudden you go back to the sermon. There is not a news outlet in the country that would say those two items were disassociated. No, they would say they were incredibly associated. They were endorsed by the same people. They were watched and viewed by the same people. Those people readily engaged in this type of entertainment and frivolity. But yet, for some reason, Christians all across the country think that the halftime show really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what they are showing. What about the connection with gambling? You know that the sports betting empire is mushrooming and blowing up, and it's now on the apps on people's phones. And so just about anybody that wants to waste money or dabbles in it can get caught up in it through these apps and whatnot. And, then there's these shallow Christians that get caught up in gambling. And I know that within Christianity, there's this debate on whether gambling is moral or immoral. But all would agree that uncontrolled gambling is terrible and we just can't go there. But what is interesting to those Christians that are like, I don't bet on this. I'm not involved in this. I've got controlled betting. They don't realize that they contribute to the conversations and the energy that build these games up and build up the interest in the minds of the gamblers themselves. So, for instance, the Christian goes to his job at work and he begins to talk about his team. And as they get excited about his team, the people that were in that conversation, maybe not the Christian himself, but the people in that conversation get excited and they go talk about it elsewhere. And somebody that's wanting to do some more betting, because he's down on his luck, he really needs to make a buck, or he's excited to just try it out. Here's the hype. And it's like, this is a can't lose situation, and probably puts some dollars that he can't afford to lose towards such. And Christians are readily participating in this hype and energy without even realizing it. What about just simple little Bible verses like Luke 16:15, where that which is exalted in the eyes of man is despised in the eyes of the Lord? If you want to get into the Greek, the word despised could actually be better rendered an abomination. In the Old Testament, an abomination was the worst sin one could be involved in. And that seems to hold true when you get over to the New Testament, because the Antichrist, who is absolutely the opposite of Jesus, our Lord and Savior, in every stretch of the imagination, the one who is going to be heinous and horrible and murderous and every other wicked thing under the sun, is called the abomination of desolation of the one who stands in the temple in the last days. And here, the scriptures tell us in Luke, what is exalted among men is despised, or is an abomination in the eyes of God. So if you can think about things that men prop up and they glorify and they exalt, those things are an abomination to God. I can't think of anything that's held up higher than the NFL Superbowl game. So does that mean God despises it? Well, how do I look at Luke and decide otherwise? With that, there is this supreme focus on the athleticism and the physicality and the speed and the power and the strength of human beings. Yeah, this is the best of the best. And look at the strategy, the strength of that coach's mind. Oh my goodness. Look at the can-do spirit and the emotional prowess of that team. And look at the pride of the crowds as they endorse all this. All of this is built up to pinnacle proportions. It is highly esteemed in the eyes of men. Thus, it's an abomination in the eyes of God. In fact, what we find in the scriptures is foolish things overturning the wise and weak things overturning the strong, such as David versus Goliath, or Joshua with his 300 men destroying an army without even using swords because God was there. Or what about the widow's mites, the 2 cents that were given that superseded that of the scribes and Pharisees' magnanimous gifts? You see, the NFL is all focused on the top, the elite, power, strength. But the focus of Christianity is in God's strength and power, not in the power of men. What about in the focus of entertainment? Because I know a lot of people are just going to just go there. Christians are like, it's just entertainment, man. It's just get off my back. It's just entertainment. I'm just watching a game. It's just a simple game. It's just a 3-hour game. That's all it is. That's not being honest nor truthful. Because what about all the pregame information and shows that are watched? What about all the post-game information and shows that are watched? What about all the conversations pre and post-game that is talking about the amazing plays and the tragedies and the upsets? And it is time-consuming. And when the scriptures tell me to be wise with my time, this doesn't seem to be a good venue for such. It absorbs a lot of time. I remember several years ago as I was trying to figure out how to minister here in America and to connect with more and more men, I was thinking to myself, I was like, well, I don't really care for sports that much, even though I played sports. I like playing sports. I actually like sports, but I don't like professional sports. But with that, like I was like, how am I going to connect with these men? I was like, I guess I'm going to have to kind of get into the NFL a little bit and study up on some of this stuff. And I just simply found out very quickly that you cannot keep up with all the research and all of the new players and all of the trades and all of the training and all of the information. It is an elaborate and time-consuming hobby that is all taken away from the work of the Lord. Can we have entertainment? Sure. Should it be exhausting to our energies for the Lord? I think not. But what's really interesting with this is when men put so much of their time in these conversations and following and keeping up with, and they put all their energy into understanding their team, it takes us to a sixth point, is that men begin to gain their identity through their team. They begin to identify with an organization that is larger than themselves, which isn't that a human need? I mean, is there anything in us that wants us to be involved with something that's larger and more important than ourselves? I wonder where the church fits into that equation. But, maybe that's just an aside. But they want to find their purpose in being part of something that is impactful and influential in the world. And if their team has won 3 in a row, they are beginning to gain traction. And man, we are becoming important and we are becoming impactful upon society. And if there's a loss, what's really interesting, these guys that are finding their identity in all this, they also begin to find their hope in the next game or the next season or the next player trade or the next coach. It is very interesting that we are finding hope for our identity of being important and connected with something in such a very passing and temporal activity instead of in the Lord. I can understand if unsaved men find their identity in it, but what about Christians? And all this brings me to a last point of Christians can't endorse the NFL simply because of the temptation to and the giving in of worshiping the NFL. I do not find NFL followers that do not worship the NFL. Now, people will call it cheering, they will call it rooting for, but I have proof that it is actual worship. Because the greatest command in Scriptures is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. It is to take all of the resources of a human being and focus it upon God. Now, when a man sees his team winning and heading towards the championship playoffs, and even more so towards the final Super Bowl event of the year, and during those moments when they just kill it and they crush the opposition, the cheers and the praise and the hooping and hollering that comes out of them cannot be topped. There is not a single bit more energy that they could have put into those moments. They have given 100%. Their wife could not get this kind of energy out of them. Their church will not get this kind of energy out of them. Work will not get this kind of energy out of them. And God sure isn't getting this kind of passion out of their life because it has been misplaced in something temporal and passing. You should have been aware of all these things previous just by the initials of the game, NFL. Not for the Lord.